Here to break down all the latest developments, Christine Dobby, who is the Canadian finance reporter at Bloomberg News. Elliott Stein is a senior litigation analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence and has also been doing some specific work on the TD story. Christine, I do want to start with you, though. Maybe you can walk us through where we're at now after a lot of information unveiled just in the last week.
Absolutely. I mean, this does go back quite a while. We've been wondering what the issue really was at TD, and the bank has been very constrained in what it could say. Last week, initially, they said they were going to take a $450 million provision. You probably remember that. They said that that was in relation to their negotiations with one of the three regulators who was probing this situation. And then on Thursday, the Wall Street Journal reported that TD was linked to this $453 million drug money laundering case, and we did later confirm that TD is connected with that case. This put a really different spin on what people are thinking about how significant this is. When the U.S. Attorney's Office announced that guilty plea, they said this was a staggering amount of money. This is about the laundering of profits related to drugs. TD wasn't the only bank involved, but drugs are, and fentanyl in particular, are a big issue for U.S. regulators, U.S. law enforcement. So this really put a different slant on the scale of the issue that TD is facing.
And Elliott, we know that TD itself has already set the table to a certain extent in setting aside money to address these issues, but it does feel like Bay Street and Wall Street have been trying to figure out ultimately what the fines net out to look like. When you do analysis, what kind of fines do you think is a reasonable expectation to be working off of?
Yeah, that's always the $1 million or $1 billion question is, how much are these banks actually going to pay out? The $450 million provision obviously sets a floor for what monetary fines could look like. But then we look at other similar cases. We don't have all the details with TD yet, except what's sort of been leaked to the press and what the bank has said. But we do look at cases in the past to see where we might have similar comparables. And there was a U.S. bank incurred a $613 million fine in 2018 for sort of similar conduct for, willfully failing to maintain their anti-money laundering processes and controls. And as a result, the bank was used by a fraudulent payday lending scheme to launder about several $100 million in proceeds. So we think that case is a good comparable. Again, U.S. Bank paid about $613 million. There was a case in 2012 where HSBC paid about $1.9 billion, but that's somewhat of a flawed comparison because that case also involved sanctions violations for doing business with countries like Burma and Sudan and Iran and Cuba that are under U.S. sanctions. So that's not, entirely a fair comparison, but there are elements of that case that lead us to believe that TD Bank's exposure here could be in the $600 million to $1.1 billion range for a monetary penalty.
And Christine, in your latest story about this, you highlighted the messaging now coming from the CEO to employees, which is, in the short term, things could be more challenging. But, for a bank as big as this, that constantly there's questions around things like succession as well, I guess, are they in a holding pattern of sorts? Like, what's the buzz around TD right now?
Right, so Masrani has been making the rounds internally. He's been holding town hall meetings. He's been meeting with executives. He's been meeting with U.S. leadership. He's been really trying to emphasize that they know this is bad. This is not a good look. They're not happy that this happened. They're putting a lot of resources into trying to improve these processes. They've invested $500 million in improving their compliance around anti-money laundering. And he did say that he's hoping that they can soon reach a global resolution of all of this, wrap it up with all of the agencies that are investigating them. But yeah, as you say, this has only really heightened the discussion around succession, CEO succession. And this is something you and I have been talking about. And, it's sort of like the evergreen question right now is what happens with Masrani, who's been in the chair for almost 10 years.
And I guess, Elliott, just to come back to you, because with the banks, especially with the Canadian banks and a bank like TD that has sizable presence in the United States, we're always asking these very, fair questions about further expansion, getting bigger, what the asset size looks like. But I guess if we think about some of the past situations, I noticed in your note you talked about the asset cap that was imposed on Wells Fargo in 2018. So for those who want to read up on that example and try to assess whether or not TD will find itself in a similar situation, what's your best guess right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the worst case scenario that a lot of banks in this situation worry about, some sort of asset cap like the one that was imposed on Wells Fargo a few years ago, where they were really restricted from growing the asset side of their balance sheet. But, I think the cases are different, right? Wells's problems stemmed mostly from retail products, and they had a whole litany of misconduct and related to those retail products, and it was just sort of one after another, and eventually the Federal Reserve got fed up and imposed that asset cap. I think the situation here is different. You don't have really retail products. Obviously, money laundering is an important issue, but it's not really, it's not hurting retail customers specifically. So I think, some other types of restrictions are probably more likely. And again, we look to the past is prologue. And in 2020, Citigroup was fined $400 million for problems with their risk controls. And in addition to that, they were also restricted from acquisitions without regulatory consent in advance. So I think maybe we see something like that here with TD. And in some ways, we've already seen it, right? Because the acquisition of First Horizon was essentially blocked in part because of these AML concerns. So we may see, that type of restriction more formalized potentially in a settlement.
Okay, and real quickly, Christine, before we let you go, TD shares have been finding some buying strength this week, but last week they were under a lot of pressure, and they've been under pressure over the course of the month as a result. What do you think the biggest questions investors are going to have going forward here?
I mean, as we've talked about, the uncertainty is really what's hurting this stock. It's been hurting the stock for months. There was a little bit of a bounce back when they got upgraded just before the AGM by Scotia, saying, a lot of the bad news is priced in at this point. But then the news got a bit worse. So yeah. I think there's a sense that we now know most of what the bad news is, but we're not certain about that yet. So I think that uncertainty is really, it's hard to imagine kind of confidently investing in it at this time.
The market hates uncertainty. It's as simple as that. So yeah, Christine, thank you very much. Yeah. Appreciate your reporting as always. Christine Dobby, who covers the banks for Bloomberg News. Elliott Stein, thank you as well, Senior Litigation Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence.